Good morning, everyone. I would like to I'd like to firstly acknowledge the traditional owner of the land, the Gadigal people of the Era Nation, and pay my respect to elders past and present. Very warm welcome to the lecture of Sydney Asian Art Series 2024. My name is Akira Isogawa. I am a multidisciplinary artist and advisory council member of Viz Asia, which is a patrons group under the umbrella of the Art Gallery of New South Wales Foundation. The Viz Asia Fund, dedicated to support Asian art exhibitions at the Art Gallery and education programs. We have been working with the University of Sydney's Power Institute on the Sydney Asian Art Series since 2017. This lecture series that the major education program Viz Asia is supporting invites leading researchers from across the world to share their work on critical issues on early, modern, and contemporary Asian art. Not only has the program provided opportunities for academics to work with colleagues across organizations and borders, it plays a crucial role in cutting better understanding and enjoyment of Asian art and culture amongst the public of Australia. The program this year focused on the idea of community in Asian art history. It is a part of a three-year program entitled PURA, Collection, Community, Care, that explores collecting histories, object provenance, shifting notion of custodianships, and the role of researchers and curators as agent of cares for artworks and their communities. On behalf of the Viz Asia Advisory Council, I thank the University of Sydney and Power Institute for creating another lineups of lectures and satellite event centering on interesting and timely topics. I thank everybody for joining us this morning, and I'm happy to hand over Yvonne Law. Thank you so much. I enjoy.
Thank you so much, Akira. Before I introduce the series, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. Specifically, I would like to acknowledge the Darug people where I live and the Gadigal people where I work. And together we pay our respect to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Hi everyone, my name is Yvonne Lowe. Very good morning to everyone. And together with Olivia Krishna, we are the conveners for this year's Sydney Asian Art Series. Today we gather online for our second of 4 lectures planned for this series. If you're joining us for the very first time, a very warm welcome to you. We are now into the second year of a 3-year series entitled Kura Collection, Community and Care, as we've heard from Akira. This year, we are focusing on community in Asian art history. And in our series, we have planned what we hope is an exciting lineup of speakers who will share with us their research and insights into community-centered practices spanning the moving image, photography, and socially engaged art initiatives. In March, we kickstarted the series with a talk on Southeast Asian contemporary artist moving image by May Adaudo Ingawangi. If you missed that and would like to catch up on that recording, you can view it on the Power Institute website. It is now with great pleasure that I hand over to Olivia, who will be introducing our second speaker for the series, Jesty. Over to you, Olivia.
Thanks very much, Yvonne. As you have just heard, my name is Olivier Krischer. I am one of the conveners of this series that's now been going for many years, and I know many joining today will be familiar. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome you, Justin. Hello.
Hello. Thank you.
Justin is joining us from yesterday, as it were, in the US. So thank you very much also for making the time to work around this schedule. Today, Justin will be talking about community and care at the edges of modernity, about socially engaged art in Japan. But as some of our audience may know, by way of introduction, rather than reading a regular kind of bio, we like to start with a couple of questions to get to know more about our speakers and their intellectual journeys, let's say. So Justin is known for his research in particular about art, aesthetics, and politics, social movements, for example, in post-war Japan. In his book, Art and Engagement in Early Post-War Japan, which I think he'll be talking a little bit about in his introduction, this was awarded the 2019 ASAP Book Prize by the Association for the Study of Arts of the Present, and I have my copy here. It's a wonderful book, which I recommend also for its very lyrical writing. That's something that I'd like to start by asking you about. But just to mention that he has also been working on more contemporary socially engaged art, as he'll be sharing today, and he's edited in 2017, for those of you interested in the topic more broadly, a two-part special issue of the online peer-reviewed journal Field, F-I-E-L-D, Field, which you'll be seeing a slide of, I believe, soon. Today, he's talking more about his recent work on socially engaged art and degrowth in Japan. But I thought I'd like to start, Justin, if I can, with a question which goes a little bit like this. For those of us researching Asian or Japanese art who are not necessarily from the region, there's often a question of how and why you got interested. How did you get here? And I'd like to nuance that question, thinking about your Art and Engagement in Early Post-War Japan book. In the book, you address art and politics in the post-war, so the 1950s and 60s, for those who aren't familiar with that work. And as you make the case in your introduction, people often focus on the 60s as the emergence of the avant-garde, stability, economic prosperity, and that kind of narrative that I think people are starting to also rethink because of work such as yours. And I guess from my perspective also, as somebody interested in that history, you gather together not necessarily the cosmopolitan, globally engaged, urban sort of history. You're looking at people who are often seen as somehow peripheral, so-called radical leftists, socialists, community organizers, as well as regional groups like Kyushu-ha, and people who were kind of seen as outsiders to the art world. So getting back to that question of, why Japan? How did you get here? I'm wondering how you came to be interested and to research these aspects of post-war Japan that are perhaps often overlooked and seen as somehow peripheral or forgotten. And what brought you to that subject and led to your book?
Well, thank you. And thank you to you and the Power Institute for inviting me and having me here to speak. It's a real honor. And in answer to that question of how I got to that particular topic, I was interested in thinking about the relation between art and politics, art and social change in a way that made sense to me, I think. And the understanding of how art affects kind of the social world, was at the time, and maybe to some extent still now, is there's an established idea that kind of disruption or criticality is an important power that art has. to cause people to think and see and feel differently. And I respect that account, and I don't disagree with that kind of argument. But at the same time was feeling that for myself, I was looking for a more kind of concrete situation or group of artists where I felt that I could see, yes, here is artists, here is art that is really sort of digging into the world that the artists find themselves in the midst of and trying to make a difference. And the question of, do they succeed in changing something or not? I don't really think that there's a much of a linear argument to be made that sort of X causes Z or something like this. But I could see in the artist's activity and their devotion to their expressive work as well, or I would say their expressive work in the sense of including everything that's needed to create the presence of it in public. So if they're a painter, they're painting and paintings, but also the mechanisms, the work that's needed to make their work visible to people, to have it participate in the worlds that they want it to participate in. I found it really interesting how the groups that I studied in the 1950s and some to a large extent in the 1960s as well, I think in Japan is a relatively few or relatively little kind of institutional funding or backing for contemporary art. And, artists were in a situation maybe where they had to find their own way to make their work relevant. So I just found that the situation in the 1950s, I think, was more uneven, less predictable. I imagine that people living at the time really didn't know what direction things were going in. And I felt that was I could feel a kind of compelling need behind the artists, their work and their words. They write a lot. Most of the artists that I've studied, and the urgency that I felt in their attempts to reach out and try to make a difference and make an impact in the world that was very fast changing at that time. And another thing that was kind of a separate thing is that many of the artists were living at the time when I started to do my research back in the early 2000s. And I find that being able to talk to people who were there, the artists themselves, or people who witnessed their work, is really helpful for me to envision sort of the whole world that they're in. And I feel that at least as an act of imagination, is just important for me personally as part of the process of understanding their works.
Thank you so much. One of the things I think is so valuable in your work is the way you look at that post-war situation as a kind of productive hybridity rather than something that's fragmented and unsettled, and that narrative, I think, or that framework, I think, is really useful for others in other contexts. But just one last question before we hand over to your talk is, I know that today you're talking about very contemporary spaces, and your recent work has been looking at these kinds of places, and I'm curious as to what happened to those forces and those people in the interim. So if we're thinking about, you've looked at this period of the 50s, and I guess your more recent work is kind of more, to some extent, even post 2011, and the sort of social tone and that type of urgency that's back, I think, certainly in arts, culture, and society after the triple disaster, for those unfamiliar, of March 2011. What happens in the interim, particularly that high bubble period where we tend to see a think of depoliticization, and as capital and industry and those sorts of aspirations are spreading, we see a kind of homogenization of culture. But obviously there's something bubbling away. Is that something that you're also, that you've looked at in, I'm thinking of the 70s, the 80s, that kind of corporate culture? What happens to those radicals?
Oh, that's a great question. To be honest, like I really haven't looked, I haven't found, I guess we could say, it's not necessarily that I haven't looked, but haven't found so many sort of like consistent paths where sort of people are moving in kind of similar mode or modality in similar direction through their whole lives. I would say that as I met the artists from my book, who some of them still active as artists, many of them still appearing for talk events and discussions. And in terms of their commitments and their thinking, I would say that their sort of critical perspective really hadn't changed very much. And that at the time when I started researching, again, this early 2000s, I think that I wasn't the only one who was starting to turn back to that period and their earlier work. I think that there was beginnings of a turn towards an awareness of the importance of politics in art, rather than as something that's to be avoided or something that devalues the artwork. So I think that as I was starting to get into it, there was some renewal of attention to them and their work, that I was sort of beneficiary. I was lucky to sort of be able to participate sort of as an audience member or as a fan. So in terms of my own positionality, I think that I personally didn't have found myself in a period when things were shifting a bit, and I have to be honest, I hadn't explored the question of how things moved through the 70s and 80s. I believe that there's depending on what kind of politics we're thinking of, like women's lib, LGBTQ plus issues, workers' issues still continue to be sort of present throughout 70s and 80s. I think that those political issues continue to sort of appear and develop. And I think different artists maybe become more prominent around those issues with different sort of stakes in it. Yeah, so I wish I had a better answer for that. It's something to think about, I think.
No, it's kind of a post-talk question, but it's fascinating. I'm going to hand over. You've already been very generous, and I hope this also encourages those here today interested in your earlier work to have a look. I will just say quickly in terms of housekeeping, many will be familiar with the webinar format. You should be able to see a kind of Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So those of you who would like to post a question or comment, please do so through that Q&A window. I'll be back at the end of Justin's talk to moderate some discussion and questions. So thank you very much again, everyone, for joining today. And I'll hand over to you, Justin, to bring your slides up.
Thanks, Olivier, and thank you everyone in the audience. So I can't say, but I appreciate your presence. So yeah, thank you for inviting me. I kind of touched on my first book, so I kind of skipped this slide, but this is a Russian translation just came out. Hopefully Japanese will be coming soon. Recently, yes, I've been working on art after the social turn, as I call it. There's a lot of names for this: socially engaged art, social practice. I think in Japan, purojekuto, art project, is a kind of the most common term. And I've been researching this for a while as well. This is a special issue, in the journal Field that I edited. And I'm hoping to kind of extend the work that was in this special issue, hopefully before, not too long. And I was really interested in this programming theme of Cura. I understand that there's 3 years, and that the last year's address a collection and curation, and this year's focus community, and next year's will be care. My talk actually touches on all 3 of these issues. I just wanted to speak briefly about each one in turn as a way to kind of orient the material that I'm going to spend most of the time introducing. First, on the topic of community, ideas of community, aspirations for community, claims that this or that community exists as a definite entity. These kinds of things appear in all kinds of political context. Even as we may desire a sense of community, we need to be aware that community and communities are not always good. They can be oppressive and nasty, just as they can be uplifting and enabling. So I want to highlight that the 3 projects that I'm going to introduce today do each serve particular communities. They have a community and they aim to foster community. But they're also working at the threshold of communities, or I might say that they're trying to create communities between or across established categories and boundaries. So they're also pushing and pulling, kind of playing with mainstream assumptions about identity and proper place. Second, in relation to care, as in care work, the activity of caring for someone, I'm interested in the way that care work is abjected by capitalism, together with vulnerability of many kinds. Not only is care work not scalable, and therefore relatively uninteresting as a project for capitalist value extraction, but also it orients towards infirmity, vulnerability, and need, which are offensive to capitalism's structure of taste. As Saito Kohei has argued, care work is kind of a new frontier of labor under degrowth conditions. Care requires a huge amount of labor, and it's focused on improving the quality of life directly in the here and now. It's not fundamentally about growth, but it does have value. And in that way, it's one example of a kind of labor that might be revalued and elevated outside of growth-obsessed capitalist value systems. So the social service providers that I'm going to introduce, these 3 providers, I'm interested in them. I see them as acting as sites of value transformation. These providers go beyond what you could call productivist rehabilitation discourses. And what I mean by productivist rehabilitation discourses is institutional discourses that emphasize productivity as a goal or like a sign of successful care, the ability to do a simple job or the capacity for self-care. Productivity, at least in Japan, is baked into care-related institutional discourses at all levels, from facility licensing to individual care regimes. The service providers I look at, though, the service providers that I'm looking at do not reject these discourses. It's good to teach someone to eat or cook by themselves, but they critique the tendency for practical or productivist discourse to define the realm of care. They're trying to develop a philosophy of care that fundamentally affirms the value of their clients' ways of life as they are. That project, however, requires a more general shift in social consciousness around basic questions of value. And that feature of their approach, I believe, makes them sites where non-growth centered life courses and values are being explored. Finally, in relation to collection and curation, I think in the interests of time, I might skip this paragraph, but basically I'm interested in how the spaces themselves might be offering us a glimpse of a kind of vernacular museum or archive that's not sort of in the form of the large institutions that we're accustomed to today. But anyway, I'll basically skip that part. So the first project that I want to introduce is the Cocoa Room, Guest House and Cafe. This was founded in 2003 by a poet, Ueda Kanayo. It started in its first few years, it was kind of an alternative art space. It was really geared towards young bohemian types. But in 2008, it moved into a new neighborhood, Kamagasaki, which has been a gathering place for day laborers in Japan since the 1950s. Day laborers were very important in the construction industries. They basically built the infrastructure and urban environment of Japan's economic miracle in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And Kamagasaki is the neighborhood in Osaka where the day labor market was located. So the area attracted men who were willing to do hard work, could travel to job sites easily, men who lived day to day, maybe because of desperate circumstances, or maybe just because they wanted to. So the neighborhood developed a rough image as kind of slum populated by drifters and outcasts. Since the 1990s, the market for day laborers has changed and moved online. So that population is now mostly aging, retired, and living on public assistance. And many have passed away by now. Many have died. When the Cocoa Room moved to Kamagasaki in 2008, day laborers and former day laborers from the neighborhood started to show up in the cafe. So it stopped being a place for kind of young artists. And it's basically a cafe. So, I mean, anyone can come in and sit down. And these new participants were people who, by and large, were not used to being listened to. They're basically outcasts from mainstream society, many of them accustomed to living very solitary lives. And as Ueda welcomed them and worked with them, she began to see how many people have never had their expressions in speech or action valued. And she developed a theory of expression through these experiences. For Ueda, expression is not a luxury or a skill, but it's kind of a fundamental feature of life. Certainly whenever a person's speaking, that's an expression, but nonverbal things like habits of movement and stuff like that are expression as well. Expression denotes a kind of unique significance to each and every life form as it lives. And one of her catchphrases that tries to get at this is to express is to live. But because it's so universal, it's also trans-individual. It lives or dies between people. It doesn't originate from inside. It's between people. In Ueda's words, expression is not an individual capacity, but something born in interaction with one's surroundings. It's not the responsibility of an individual if they're unable to express themselves well. It's something that is made together with the people around them. It's easy to forget that people live by interacting with others and that no one's able to live entirely by themselves. I believe society will never work by simply dismissing difficult people who express themselves poorly from the space of expression. The kind of expression necessary to live cannot be achieved within a logic of exclusion. And most basically, I think the Cocoa Room is a space that values and nurtures expression as something that's sustained by both the speaker and the listener. The activities around the Cocoa Room are as much about listening as they are about speaking, as much about appreciating as they are about creating. Ueda's core practice, something that she returns to in her writing and her work, is nicknamed kotane. It's an abbreviation for the phrase that means seeds of the heart. And this practice is basically pair work. Person A speaks about their life. And there's often a prompt for that, like something like remember a favorite place from your childhood. Person B listens and then writes a poem or a story based on what they heard. Then they change roles and do that reverse. And then finally, everybody shares, takes turns sharing their writing in front of the group. It's a very simple model. I doubt it's unique to Ueda. Some key points, though, are that it's accessible. You know, people talk about their own experience, which most people can do to an extent. The writing also, it's writing somebody else's expression. So it's already shaped partly in the initial telling. And the process includes listening and translation from A's spoken words to B's writing. And also in that, a kind of transformation. A can see their experience represented back to them, slightly different, slightly not theirs anymore, but now shared by others. So the process serves to surface and shape and make public experiences of people who for much of their lives may have been considered anonymous or voiceless. So it allows people to see their words, their very selves, as valuable, worth listening to, worth talking about. It also creates a supportive space where people who have been isolated, people who have learned to live as loners, people who have learned not to trust others, can develop a basic level of trust and resilience. The moment when person A is talked about by person B, that shows how A exists in person B's mind and words. So it takes some trust to let that happen. Person A has to be able to relinquish some control to let themselves exist in other people's words and worlds. And I think that only when people allow themselves to exist in other people's minds can there be the beginnings of a world in common, a community. So this basic practice, Seeds of the Heart, I believe plants seeds of community as well. And the practice is easy, it's very simple. So it's very easily adapted to oral history, ethnography. It can be playful, it can be serious. So there are a lot of variations on it. And poetry writing workshops remain kind of mainstay, but they have been gradually joined by many, many dozens of different kinds of collaborative, creative, expressive activities, calligraphy, chorus. There are several theater groups, drawing and painting, astronomy, gamelan, local history. One recent project was digging a well in the Cocoa Room's back garden. This well was dug by hand. They made bricks. They made the bricks themselves using the sand that they excavated. Part of the idea for this was to demonstrate a kind of DIY idea, like we can take care of ourselves. Of course, they have running water. They don't need the well water, but just as a sort of idea. And Ueda also used it to put the old men of the neighborhood more front and center. Almost all of them have construction experience, so their expertise is more on display in this kind of project. I think it also has a kind of, we'll go back to this slide, a kind of fictional quality to it. It's a real well with water at the bottom, but it seems at the same time like it's kind of a fairy tale, like it's there to help people dip into their imaginations. So I want to distill some points. As I do that, I'm going to let this video play. This is a video that a screen recording that I made of me navigating around the Cocoa Room. So you can go and visit the Cocoa Room's website and do your own navigation through the space. A pretty cool rendering of the space. I'll just let it play as I speak. So the first thing that I want to point to is that Ueda's artwork is a kind of life work or a life practice, is a work that evolves out of her entire practice of living day to day, year to year. The Cocoa Room is at base a cafe and now a guest house too. So it's open from 10 in the morning to 8 or 9 in the evening. This creates a certain kind of accessibility. You can go anytime. You can spend as much time or as little time there as you want. You don't have to buy anything, so you can just go in there and hang out. So it's reliable. I think that reliable openness is something that contributes to its viability as a spot for community formation. People can rely on it. They have communal lunch and dinner every day, which anyone can join if they pay. It's not free. And Ueda herself is available. She's at the Cocoa Room most of the day, almost every day, all year. She's a reliable presence. And I think this is part of her practice. She's not a therapist, but she really tries to support people who come into her orbit. For example, there was a young man who she was really trying to support and sort of bring into the kind of circuit of the Cocoa Room. He went to prison, unfortunately. He was very vulnerable and was taken advantage of by, I think, a gang, and was got caught for doing something illegal for them. And when he was in jail, Ueda wrote a postcard to him every day. Every single day, she sent a postcard to him, and then went and met him when he got out of jail. So she's really dedicated to people. And so being in one place for a long time also enables the Cocoa Room to build alliances and collaborations with other shopkeepers, other social service providers in the area. There are a lot of day spaces in Kamagasaki. So there's a lot of sharing and bartering. They host a monthly free dental clinic. There's a mini farmers market that sets up a table once a week out in front. One long-running initiative is called the Kamagasaki University of the Arts. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it has two terms, like a real university per year, and it has several classes each term. And those university classes take place kind of all around the neighborhood. Some of them are in the Cocoa Room itself. Some are in other community centers or like a meeting space, like a common area in an apartment building. So there is a network as a community connections with the neighborhood. And this is not systemized care. The Cocoa Room is not a licensed social service provider. It's licensed as a cafe and guest house. But I think that aspect can make it more approachable for some people who don't trust institutions. And in a sense, it's a kind of caring that we might think of a community being caring. It doesn't give therapy for specific conditions, but fosters a sense of ease and belonging. At the same time, or maybe as part of that, Ueda's project pushes back against the discrimination that suppressed the elderly people who congregate in this neighborhood and the discrimination against the area as a whole. And that's not really for anything. There isn't a subsequent goal or purpose. It's for the people themselves. And the guest house brings in new faces almost every day, travelers coming from all over kind of wander through. And so there's a real breeziness to the space and its communities at the same time that it's very firmly rooted and sort of committed to that location. The second project that I'd like to introduce is named Creative Support Let's, or CS Let's. It's located in Hamamatsu City in Shizuoka. It was founded by Kubota Midori, initially as a talking group. Kubota's son is a person with special needs, and so this originated from basically a talking group of other parents, but really mothers of people with special needs. And it grew steadily and became an MPO in 2004. Now it has 2 buildings and provides 3 kinds of day service. It has about 25 clients, and the clients are on the severe end of the developmental disability spectrum. There's a classification system that the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare uses that has 6 classes of disability. And CS Let's serves people who are in 4, 5, and 6. So it's the more severe side of the spectrum. CS Let's is a licensed social service provider. In that sense, it is a bit different from the Cocoa Room, but there are some similarities as well. I should note that Kubota and Ueda are also friends. They collaborate on things occasionally. A unique feature of CS Let's is that it does not impose rehabilitation goals on its clients. The clients basically do what they want, and the staff assists them, encourages them, gives framing to what they're doing. This is one of their sort of mission statements on their website. We support whatever the person wants to do, whatever it is they like, whatever they get passionately involved in, even things seen as problem behaviors. We aim to create connections between the person and society and build a realm of daily life that does not stop at the facility walls by affirming each person as they are. We find a role, a job, for each person in society based on their individuality as a person with disability, and then put it into practice. So they really focus on the individuality of each client. They actually use the word talent instead of client or user, the OSHA. It's a more kind of technical, I guess, term. And they have these playful profiles that introduce each of the people in turn, and they even have a deck of cards that they give to visitors so that the visitors can know people's names and interact with them. And let me just kind of give you one example of a person who is a user of CS-LETS, a client. I'll nickname him Andre. I'm using a nickname really more out of sort of, I don't know, propriety in relation to the audience here. They're very, very public. Their names and faces are all over the web, thanks to all the very aggressive publicity that CS-LETS engages in. I'll get to that in a second. But let's call this gentleman Andre. He has a very well-defined set of activities. He spends most of the morning walking around, pacing back and forth. He paces. As he paces, he occasionally jumps and hops, or occasionally stops very suddenly. He'll sometimes shout, again, very suddenly, sometimes words or phrases, sometimes just sounds, but quite loudly. At some point in the afternoon, he'll sit down with a stack of paper and start writing very vigorously. Sometimes letters, sometimes numbers, sometimes just scribbling. And he'll do that for a few hours, and then it's time to go home. He also loves taping things to walls, so he sometimes does that as well. And these are not random activities for him. He's committed to them, and he performs them with intensity. If someone tries to make him stop doing what he wants to, he will resist and eventually become violent. He arrived at LETS after being expelled from another care facility because he attacked staff and patients. At that facility, they had tried to regiment his activity. They tried to train him to squash aluminum cans as a kind of productive activity, and he rebelled. And according to Kubota, that's not uncommon for the LETS clients. Many of them have arrived at LETS after having trouble fitting it at other facilities. So for Andre, pacing, hopping, shouting, scribbling, taping things to walls are activities that he's committed to, and they fill much of his waking life. How can we approach that kind of activity? They're not labor. It's not labor. It's not compatible with production in contemporary economic system. It's not compelling as art either, or as performance. And CS-LETS doesn't claim that. It doesn't claim the client's work in that way. This is another one of their mission statements where they make clear our goal is not to sell paintings or performances. We do not claim that making artworks is a kind of job. People are definitely making something. They are doing something. But we are not fixated on the idea of a work. Rather, people do what they want to do as a daily activity, and we position that as their work. And I think this last sentence is really key. We position that as their work. I'll come back to that in just a sec. But there's something fundamentally important about Andre's activities. What's lacking is an appropriate social form to value them. And the idea behind LETS is that we, or society, need to take these activities seriously as such. Doing that, taking them seriously as such, as they are, puts a lot of demands on the viewer, on society. The talents activities are often disruptive, transgressive. Maybe more fundamentally, they're deeply mysterious. We really have no way of knowing what the activities mean to the people pursuing them. And if this attitude towards the patients and their activities is one cornerstone of the LETS approach, the other cornerstone is their ongoing experimentation in developing contexts for the talents to appear as themselves in the outside world. So we position that as their work, this sort of positioning, that's kind of the prime activity of LETS, I think. And there are lots of different programming sort of series that they engage in over the years. One of the longer running ones is called Hyogen Miman. It's kind of difficult to translate, but not quite art is how I think of it. And this basically is a project of taking things that the clients make, whatever that might be, strange objects or activities or habits, and presenting them both online. And then once a year, I'm not sure if it's totally regular, but about once a year, they'll have a festival around Hyogen Miman, not quite art. that's kind of like an art fair, where they have kind of a little area where each client will sort of hang out and engage with people who visit. The amount of material that they generate in terms of images and comments and ideas in relation to the client's activities is huge. So there's, if you go visit their website, you can just keep going for a very long time. They have a YouTube channel. It's pretty impressive. Another programming kind of grouping that they have is titled Statan. This is based on what was a real television show in Japan that was popular. It was Star no Tanjo, is like Birth of a Star, is the Japanese title of the show, and the abbreviation is Statan. So they've kind of lifted that title and used the talent show format and use it as a kind of way to create a stage for not just the talents to perform things, but anyone can bring a sort of unique idiosyncratic talent and show it on stage. And part of the structure of this event is the judges. So there are judges who are there who comment on whatever it is that the person who's showing off their weird talent have to comment and create meaning or associations. So it's like that really models a kind of active reception or active engagement on the part of the viewer. So this also there's a lot of recordings of these over the years, and this is sort of a format that they have developed into like a kit, so anyone can do it who wants to try it in their own town or with their own group of friends. They can do a Statan event if they want to. And the point is that these contexts invite an audience. So they amplify the position of the audience. They kind of clarify it. The performance is given when we're talking about the Let's talents. The Let's clients don't change what they do very much. They do what they want to. The challenge is how to receive them, how to notice and feel value in what they're doing. And that to me is a question of aesthetics, of how we receive the world sensorially. And as I was thinking about this, one of the most prominent catchphrases that CS Let's uses is this phrase, away from the normal, towards who we are as we are. Atarimae kara aru ga mama e. And as I was thinking about this phrase, it reminded me of the way that Viktor Shklovsky, the Russian formalist, theorist, critic, talks about art's defamiliarization effect. This is a quote from Shklovsky. Habituation devours works, clothes, furniture, one's wife, and the fear of war. And art exists that one may recover the sensation of life. The purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived, not as they are known. I feel like that final phrase, as they are perceived, not as they are known, is has similar kind of vibe as a CS Let's project. I'm going to, again, I'm going to let this video play as I speak. I'm hoping the sound is off so you can see this is a documentary that you can get a sense of the space of CS Let's. You'll see that the walls are all covered with stuff. So the staff of Let's almost all come from theater and arts backgrounds. And that's something I think is really indispensable for the success of this model. They know how to work with activity without reducing it or finding an endpoint to it. They repeatedly frame and reframe the daily activities of the users, photographing the activity, recording it, decorating the walls with the results of it, going on walks outside, kind of parades, holding recitals and festivals, inviting people inside. The talents at Let's with the more serious disabilities don't produce concrete works. Their work is oftentimes in the form of behavior. One of the clients sways, it's kind of dancing or bodily expression. Another loves music and stereo equipment, so much so that there needs to be like a veteran, experienced caregiver along with him when they go on walks. Otherwise, if there's like a novice, then he'll run into an electronics store and nobody can get him out once he's gone into one. Andre hops and shouts. So there's a young woman who has a knack for making nicknames. So any new visitor, she'll come up with a funny nickname for them. These aren't art in the general, the general understanding of what art is. But the staff work with it as if it is. They treat it as having aesthetic significance, something to be treasured, something to be remarked upon, appreciated, not just tolerated, but admired. So C.S. Letts is a very clear endeavor that tempts and invites people to admire what the talents are doing by framing them as potentially valuable, but it leaves the answers on the side of the audience. It's an example of art functioning as a kind of framework, a pretext, a provocation, where different life courses and ways of being can be recognized. And the intent is, I think, revalued, in this case, through habits of celebration, curiosity, and humor. This is the person who makes nicknames for people. And here also there's clearly a community of Letts users and caregivers, which is legally established at some level in contracts. But Letts refuses to let those legal arrangements define the community. The Takeshi Bunka Center, the newer of the buildings that they have, is located downtown right at the edge of Hamamatsu's like entertainment district. So if you go out the back, you're kind of in this area that's all bars and clubs and restaurants. The front door is always open during the open hours. So if you can just walk in off the street, and there's an info shop in the entry area of the building, so you can walk in and sit down at the table and grab a magazine or a book that's sort of around the kind of table in that area. So it tries to be an open space that anyone can go into. This is one of the parades that they do. So where was I here? Oh, there are scheduled tours once a month. And then there are 4 apartment rooms on the top floor of the new building that Kubota is hoping to build a kind of system where the clients could live there in like 2 or 3 of the 4 apartments, and then have one guest room where people could visit and stay for a few days, kind of like a homestay. So Letts isn't only providing a space for community, but trying to alter the way that community appears in broader society. They're trying to alter space around that community, kind of reform the rest of society with that community at the center. The final group that I want to introduce is Harmony. This serves people with chronic mental illness. Let me just check on the time. Okay, I think I'm okay. Okay, I think we're good. Lost my space. It's basically a day space where people congregate, where the clients congregate during the weekdays to talk, to engage in some activities, to support each other. Largely, though, the approach of Harmony, and this is also a licensed social service provider, but like C.S. Letts, the Harmony fundamentally respects its clients' autonomy and lets them do what they please. Their goal is not to induce their clients to conform, but to find value in what they like to do, including activities that emerge from or address or foreground their illness. Japan's Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare actually requires that service providers like Harmony provide some kind of job training or engage their clients in some kind of productive activity. At Harmony, that takes the form of cultural production. So they create This is just a photo of inside the space. They create games, books, poetry collections. This is a photo of Karuta. It's like a gaming card set that is made by the clients of Harmony. The artwork is theirs, and there's text that goes along with the pictures that is about the client's experiences. In truth, the founder and director of Harmony, Shinzawa Katsunori, is opposed to the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare's emphasis on capitalist-defined productivity. He started his career as a social worker caring for people who had very severe congenital conditions that left them basically bedridden. And this was a formative experience for him. It forced him to confront the bare fact of living beings who would never, ever be productive, who would never get better. And the act of caring for these individuals never really amounts to anything. Care work keeps them comfortable, we hope, but it's not cumulative. It's not moving the client towards any goal. It's simply sustaining them as they are. And in Harmony as well, Shinzawa's emphasis is on sustaining people without demanding they move in a particular direction or meet a particular metric. Similar to Let's, Shinzawa creates opportunities for the clients to make connections with others and to express themselves as themselves. And these opportunities are voluntary. Not all the clients participate in all of them. There's a rock band that they have. There are several writing projects. The kind of longest running thing is the card set. They have several versions of this card set. And as the title of this card set indicates, hearing voices and seeing things, as this indicates, many of the projects foreground the delusions that the clients experience as part of their illness. Many of the Harmony clients have conditions that give them very richly developed fictional, fantastical worlds. The way that society typically deals with that is to encourage people who suffer from them to hide them, keep it out of sight. Harmony's creative work endeavors to make those individual worlds of fantasy public and shareable. And I want to emphasize that this is voluntary. No one is being forced to share things that they don't want to. One project that illustrates this, they worked on together with the social practice artist Fukusawa Takafumi. It's called Harmony Land. Here's a map of Harmony Land. It's a bit difficult to decode, but basically the red area on that diagram is the real world. The clients' names and nicknames are there. There are a couple of staff in there as well. And the part outside the red area is the realm of fantasy that the clients partially live in, but is invisible to everyone else. One client has a recurring delusion that they are being stalked by an organized crime gang. Another likes to invent fabulously wealthy spouses for himself, who are incredibly successful career-wise and travel the world. And he loves talking about like Anastasia, who is French. It's a very, very rich imagination. One client experiences visitations from aliens from the planet Goa. And Harmony Land was envisaged as a way to introduce visitors to the clients, including with reference to their worlds of fantasy. So there was one walking tour. This was part of the programming around Harmony Land, where Kevin, as I'll call him, it's not that's not his real name, it took a group of people to sites where he had episodes in his life. So he in the top right, is where he's taking, and this is publicity photos before the event actually happened. So there are no people there, but it was like a walking tour. So there would have been like 10, 15 people for the actual event. He took them to the park where he saw a UFO come down from the planet Goa one evening. And so he would tell the group what the experience was like. Shinzawa told me that the clients are able to see their delusions from the outside most of the time, if they're not in the midst of an episode, and understand how fantastical they seem from an everyday perspective. So these events are not following people who are having a crisis, who are having an episode, but it's a chance for people to talk about their episodes to a small audience. an opportunity to share their whole self with others. I should add that Harmony does provide sort of more orthodox information about mental illness to audiences as well. Like this is a page from a booklet that goes along with their card set that has an essay explaining by Shinzawa that explains. This is a chart that tries to explain the kind of onset and dissipation of an episode, and it talks about the impact it has on people's lives. And I'd like to think that this kind of information and the experience of hearing about it from the person suffering from mental illness would make someone more empathetic, more understanding towards someone having an episode, you know, in the world around them. It's a very common experience here in Seattle. So like Let's and Cocoa Room, this prompts the viewer, the listener, to get out of themselves, to use their imaginations as part of a practice of radical acceptance. So to wrap up, the Cocoa Room is not solving the epidemic of loneliness and isolation among older adults. C.S. Letts is not solving disability. Harmony is not moving past mental illness. They help to ameliorate those problems, to make them less painful, I think. But their significance as art projects lies in the way that they frame the prospect of living with these issues, either as a person with mental illness or a caregiver, or maybe just a passerby. But building cultures, building communities where living with people with disabilities or illness is interesting, attractive, rewarding, fun. Coming back to Saito Kohei, when he argues that we have to live on less or that care work should be revalued, it can sound depressing. It can sound boring, hopeless. Care work demands so much and it's so hard. And the person being cared for is not necessarily going to get better. Maybe this is life. Maybe this is all it's ever going to be. Projects like the Cocoa Room and C.S. Letts and Harmony show how full of riches the world can be, even if it's never going to be more than what we have now. It's up to us, the viewer, the listener, the liver of life in a limited world. We always have the autonomy of the imagination. And I think that these projects teach us that and show how the prospect of caring for others is not a dead end or a thankless task, but a portal into the universes that lie within other people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justin. It's amazing. And I think that, like myself, people are also processing a lot right now. I would welcome Nick's also put a comment in the Q&A window for people to post their questions there, or even if you've got comments, please do share. I will perhaps start off if I can. In your conclusion, you sort of talk about these as art projects, and through your description, you've, I think, very productively been able to talk about the ways in which they are and aren't framed as such by the people sort of working on them. I'm interested to hear a little bit more, I guess, about the interface between these spaces and what might be construed as the art world. And so you mentioned, for example, the work of Fukusawa Takafumi, who, sort of social practice artist. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about some of those experiences, if you know, in each of these spaces. Do they seek out those sorts of interactions? Do they avoid them? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. I'm just trying to pull up a website. There's, I would say that first of all, the spaces that I'm aware of that are interested in, that are really interested in art, are relatively small. I think larger care facilities might be quite large buildings, 3 or 4 stories, have maybe 100 clients, or so these are relatively small. I think that the vision that sort of animates them is largely dependent on the founder and director. So it has they each have a very clear logic to them that plays through in a lot of messiness. There's a lot of stuff, but I think that there's some very clear, elegant, and kind of refined sort of underlying logic or aesthetic to them. So I think a lot of it depends on the person who founds it and is running it. And I think that the people who work as staff in these facilities also tend to be people with some connection to creative worlds, musicians, writers, sometimes visual artists, but they're kind of creative types, I think, much of the time. So they tend to sort of self-select or kind of attract people, I think, who are into that way of approaching the clients and approaching the issue of how they fit into, or how they should fit into mainstream society. To give an answer of like how they intersect with the art world, I think that in Japan there has been the roles that art can have in therapy. So there are approaches that use art to achieve therapeutic goals. That's something that I'm not studying. I'm frankly not qualified, I think, to study how effective therapeutically art therapy is. But there's a great deal of study of that. There are spaces that nurture outsider artists that function as galleries, essentially, that help to sell the work of artists who produce works that are more like in traditional formats of paintings and sculpture that can be marketed. And I think that sort of at the level of institutions, there's a lot of acceptance and enthusiasm for this kind of work. And part of me honestly thinks that it's because it's a little bit easier to deal with the politics of inclusion around people with special needs than it is to deal with the politics of inclusion around, for instance, immigrants. So projects that work with immigrant populations, projects that explore the experience of, say, Zainichi Koreans in Japan that are more politically fraught, those are much less prominent. We really have to kind of go searching for projects like that. And those kinds of projects tend to be really like shoestring. They can't really develop an institutional housing around them. So I think that to an extent, this is inclusion, hokatsu, is a real key term, I think, for governmentality, I guess you could say, in Japan today. And this kind of inclusion, I think, is something that is relatively easy for people to digest or to experience as non-threatening. And there is one festival that I wanted to share that kind of brings a lot of these groups together. I'd known the Cocoa Room for quite a long time, but C.S. Letts and Harmony I encountered through this festival called the I think that's showing up, the Turn Festival. And this is run partly by Geidai. So there's an artist, Hibino Katsuhiko, who's older generation, very well-established artist, similar generations like Murakami Takashi, who kind of heads up this project. And this runs once a year. I'm not sure if it's still going, but it would bring together like maybe each iteration would have like 15 or 20 different facilities that worked in different ways with disabled or differently abled clients in creative ways. Yeah.
That's really interesting to hear. I was going to ask a question about Zainichi in particular when you're talking about Osaka day labor, and I wondered if there's that kind of layer to the community around Cocoa Room, but maybe we can come back to that.
Sure.
The first question in our Q&A segues a little bit with what we were just talking about. But so I might skip to the second, which is saying, it's great to hear about your research. They're interested in how ideas of hyogen or expression are negotiated by the various people who are coming together to forge these amazing communities. In particular, what kinds of contestation exist, if at all, and how are these managed or worked through?
It's a great question. And I think that in some sense, so and this actually, I hadn't really thought this through, but the question kind of prompts me to recognize that each of these organizations are organizations. So like they employ people. So there's a way that the group of people who are working there, who might be artists or creators, are hired by the people running them. So in that sense, the kind of aesthetic community, the community of performers or musicians, is selected actually by the the director or the head of the institution. So in that sense, it's not sort of a natural community, sort of like people who just ended up near each other. It really is kind of highly selected to function to further the goal of the organization. So in that sense, like the contestation among artists who might be moving in different directions, I don't think really comes to the surface so much inside, like among, say, the employees of the Cocoa Room or among the employees of CS Let's. But it definitely comes up between, say, the Cocoa Room and other groups of artists in South Osaka, or CS Let's and other service providers around Hamamatsu. And in terms of how the kind of artistic stakes play out, I would say it's usually more of the debate, more of the criticism, more of the contestation is on the social service side. So these service like CS Let's and Harmony are not terribly popular. They're not the mainstream of social service provision, and I think more orthodox social service providers don't see CS Let's as not appropriate way to approach disability. And in terms of the creative side, I can't think of a particular example where there's been sort of like, we have a different vision of, say, homelessness or near homelessness in Osaka. And we want our, like, I actually can't think of a specific kind of friction point in terms of artistic expression, sort of artists criticizing the artistic side. I'll keep thinking about it, but one thing I would say is, and I have heard artists, so cooperating, so many of these, so the Cocoa Room, CS Let's, Harmony, other places as well, have artists who come and work with the clients on a particular project. And I have heard artists say specifically, like, because, a practicing artist, it's a bit difficult to know what to do with the discourse of like, everybody's an artist, And I heard one artist say, like, I love Duchamp's very important and everything, but everything's an artist really kind of hits me the wrong way. I'm a professional artist. And so I have heard that, and not so much as like a criticism, but artists sort of raising the point that there are still artists that need to be, that have special skills, that bring special value to the table. Yeah.
Interesting. There's a lot more to flesh out there. I'd love to talk more about it. I want to go on to the next question from Mark at Power, who I think is bringing it also back to the context that you're interested in around degrowth, for example, and the sort of larger social, political, economic kind of contents in which this work has emerged, let's say. So Mark writes, how do you relate this community-oriented and curative project to your thesis in the field special issue? And I quote, perhaps Japan's experiments in new public art are the obverse of the avant-garde, scattered ad hoc and somewhat unassuming attempts to find value amongst the pockets left after the pox of developmentalism has passed. So Mark asks, is this kind of art/care practice to be taken seriously as a form that understands that developmentalism, in quotes, is not just over, but leaves, so to speak, a radioactive legacy?
Yeah, so I sensed two slightly different questions. The easier one to answer is the issue of the avant-garde. So I do sometimes use the phrase avant-garde to talk about this kind of art, in the sense that I am looking at artists and their work as exploring the future. I approach them as giving us glimpses of the future or possible futures. So in that sense, I see a historical significance, kind of the history of the future aspect to their work, and I think that that's a kind of classically avant-garde idea of history and art's relation to it. But the work doesn't look avant-garde in the way that we typically think of avant-garde art. It's much homier. So that's my answer, I think, to that part of the question. The question of the legacy of developmentalism. And this, yeah, that's I think a genuine critique. I think that maybe in a different but similar way to the way that, say, Zainichi Korean experience is not nearly as prominent as, say, art in relation to people with developmental disabilities, for instance, that the more politically fraught questions tend to, it's difficult for them to appear in the kind of institutionally situated context that, like, these service providers have. Like, even the Cocoa Room is critical. Certainly Ueda is very critical of contemporary Japanese society in many ways, but it is a location, it has like a license, it's a store. Even more so for the service providers, as well for like the big art festivals, like Echigo Tsumari or the Naoshima, you know, those big ventures have to, in a sense, compromise at some level with the politics around them. And so things like, you know, talking about the health effects of radioactivity, things like this that are very pointed for kind of mainstream discourse and politics in Japan is I think still actually, it's a good way to say that the kind of 1960s, what I've called kind of the volcanic avant-garde of criticism, of disruption, of sudden, very visible, memorable critique, like Chimpom, for instance, that I think that, you know, that remains, I think, the way for art to address those really toxic political legacies, industrial legacies, in that it's just not, it's something that you kind of can't get past the city office people if you're trying to operate sort of an institution.
It makes me think a little bit of I guess the distinction that's been made around art projects, projecto as they're called, and that idea of kind of negotiating or working with or even within the system to realize some kind of change. So what you were describing around C.S. Letts, for example, trying to kind of shape its community from, you know, where it is, makes me think of Chiyoda Art Center, you know, Sansan Saichi, that sense of sort of embeddedness in the system rather than trying to kind of topple that system, which is a difficult thing to explain sometimes outside certain contexts, you know, if we're talking about social engagement.
And
Thank you.
I tend to look at like there are like third rails, so to speak. I think that there's a lot of possibilities within those kinds of contexts, but there are some things that are sort of absolute no-goes. Yeah. And I think it's really important to be aware of what those are. Yeah.
Interesting. Is there, because we have a little bit of time, it's bringing to mind, because we did mention how much this is also coming out. There's a lot of attention, of course, after 2011, the triple disaster. And there was, my understanding is that there was a lot of resources. There was, on the one hand, kind of bottom-up activity, but also a lot of top-down. This sort of reconstruction work that was also attracting resources towards art projects. So Machiokoshi, this these sorts of art festivals and so on. And there was a certain critique that could be made of the government sort of outsourcing some of its, responsibilities, or to what extent is there that kind of conversation? I'm not looking to critique the spaces, but I think within the spaces, to what extent are they kind of conscious of or working against or with that sort of the potential to be kind of co-opted into essentially a top-down sort of agenda? Is that something that they discuss, or is it?
Yes, it's certainly something that they discuss. Because it comes up in criticism of their work occasionally. Because from the perspective of say, like if you are coming in with assumptions about, say, Chimpong mode of artistic expression, politicized artistic expression, there's plenty of room to sort of feel like dissatisfied. I think like there's something waiting for the second, the other shoe to drop, like it's missing something, So I think that there is an awareness of something about the genre, sort of the affordances and what's not possible given certain kind of situation. My feeling is that with these facilities, they have a particular mission that is kind of focused and really makes sense as it's not sort of society as a whole, but is a little bit more focused than sort of politics generally. And for me, that is usually provides a way to understand this issue of co-optation, is that there are a lot of social functions that, frankly, governments are going to be involved in. But that doesn't mean that governments should be defining. And in Japan, there's a big bureaucracy. It's a very sort of administrative state. It's kind of active state, as it's been called. So, there's a way that local government can kind of just take over something like caregiving. So taking pushing back against government agendas in that sector, I think is meaningful, even if it doesn't necessarily sort of address more the other kinds of politics. In terms of the kind of the replacing social service functions with sort of artists, or kind of like trying to use artists to do social work, my sense is that there is not that much of a danger of that. Like the kind of funding that goes into social services like Let's or Harmony or elderly care, the amount of money that goes into those facilities is just enormous. There's the idea, I think, that artists are kind of taking the place of that and sort of causing that not to be done properly. I don't think there's really much of an argument there. I do think that I do have a concern about the impact on art, in the sense that the patronage at that sort of large scale is shifted, I think, by the social turn. I think that the social place of art, the way that artists sustain themselves, eat, carry on their work, has been and is affected by this. So I think that it does and can affect the way that artists work. Don't really see that in censorship so much, but I think that it has created a kind of a center of gravity that was not nearly so prominent, say, in 1990. Not sure if that's probably not a very satisfactory answer to the question, but yeah, some thoughts anyway.
No, that's again, I think that's something that we definitely can also build on. I'm going to just take the one last question because it's talking, I mean, there's certain assumptions which I think would be interesting to flesh out, because you've pointed to the potential of art practice to sort of glimpse certain futures. And certainly when it comes to degrowth and thinking about economies around the world, it's tempting to see Japan as some kind of glimpse of a future of what happens in deflationary sort of economies or contexts. Whereas this question is asking more about the cultural context and whether it says, there's a high sort of collectivist culture that's often imagined in Japan. Does this make it easier to integrate community-based projects compared to perhaps more individualist cultures? And here they are seeing Australia and the US as more individualist. Is there a cultural context, or is that not in the age of sort of capital, post-capital?
I mean, that's a tough question. It's a kind of a loaded question, I guess, for me. I kind of have to be careful about how I say it. It's interesting, like when I just kind of talking from my training as a graduate student. I was in graduate school in the early 2000s. It was still, my professors would like rigorously drum into us, there's no such thing as culture. There's no such thing as Japanese culture. Very anti kind of Nihonjin non kind of theory of Japanese uniqueness. This kind of culturalist discourse was like, no, you are not allowed to invoke that. You must always criticize it. But I think that there's a way that things that 30 years ago in the field of Japan studies would have been assailed as essentialist, culturalist arguments are, kind of bubbling back up in the context of this question. And I think not just in relation to Japan, but in terms of indigeneity. A revaluation of indigenous practices, especially as a rejection of the kind of global suicide of unhindered capitalist extraction development. This has become something that is happening, I think, in relation to a lot of other cultures. I would say that in the case of Japan, it's particularly difficult because Japan, actually going the other way, because Japan is in such an industrialized, modernized country. I feel that it's slightly different, or rather quite different from, say, people revaluing Native American practices and forms of belief. Like that form of indigeneity is genuinely still like deeply disempowered. Right, and the victim of sort of unimaginable historical injustice and violence in a way that's not true with Japan. And Japan has a history of quite the opposite. So I think it's a tricky issue. And I honestly, personally, I'm not sure, as a scholar, I say I'm going to have to grapple with this. But I do try not to sort of default to that kind of culturalist explanation. On the other hand, I do have to ask, it's a legitimate question, I think.
Thank you. That has also brought us up for time. You've been very generous with your responses. There's a lot more that we could obviously talk about. I would encourage those people here to also check the chat. Nick has been posting some links there to some of the projects and websites that you've talked about today. So I just want to thank you once again very much for sharing your work with us today, Justin. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining.